Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. It's 1-855-450-6624. Send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Wow, what a holiday break, a Christmas break I had. How was yours?
It was good. Here's the thing. Christmas break, I don't know about for you. For me, Christmas break is the opportunity for me to really dig into my personal projects and my personal hobby things. And it really, Steve, it started out as a kid by way of, more challenging missions in some ways. So it would be things like we're going over to Grandma and Grandpa's and I needed to find some way to play the Nintendo 64 at Grandma and Grandpa's, but Grandpa would never let me connect anything to his television because I might break it, plugging down cables in that I don't recognize. So I had to find a way to bring a small TV, and that meant doing things like watching the thrift stores to find small little portable televisions that at the time they were black and white, but they had composite inputs, and so you could do. So started out with those sorts of things. These days, you fast forward through, and it's an opportunity to dig in. Oftentimes with my kids, they'll have a particular project that they're working on or something they're interested in. And so I spent a lot of time over the Christmas break. Actually, it came in from a listener had suggested a Gamon, Gamon drawing tablet. And I ended up buying some for my girls for Christmas. And so we spent not a disproportionate amount of time getting those tweaked and set up and so that they can draw. But that was my Christmas break, is I had a lot of time to catch up on projects.
It sounds like you and I had a similar idea.
We did. In fact, Steve, I'm excited to talk about this. A lot of things happened over the Christmas break, so we'll jump in and talk about a lot of it. I want to get started by talking a little bit about YouTube DL and some of the changes they're making. So the short version is YouTube wants to limit content to only their users, or at least people that could potentially become their users. And as a part of doing that, they are becoming more and more aggressive with the IP addresses that they're banning. It used to be that if you ran YouTube DL or YTDLP inside of a data center or something where there was an IP address for which it was known that there was going to be a lot of traffic or a lot of people, it was expected that would fail. But recently, that started to happen inside of people's homes. Steve, you ran into this. Tell me about the 403s you were hitting with YouTube.
Yeah, so one of the things here that I should put out front is that I'm not trying to do any level of privacy protection. I figure that I'm on YouTube. I treat YouTube like any other subscription service. If I cared about people knowing what I watched, then I wouldn't watch it on that service. Like, I feel like any Google domain is essentially like writing a billboard about all of the things that you do on that domain. And so I'm not particularly privacy conscious when it comes to YouTube. And so with that in mind, one of the things that I do when I come across stuff that I would like to archive or have available for offline, particularly because there are educational things, such as, so there's a channel, this was spawned by a channel that's called NB, so N as in Nancy, B as in Bob TV, and it's the host is a very good teacher, and she talks about things like privacy and security, and those are her focuses since I think 2018. And there was some stuff in there that I wanted specifically my kids to be able to watch, but as we know, giving like free reign to YouTube, even unintentionally, you'll get dragged away because the autoplay doesn't necessarily continue on the channel that you're on, and it just kind of drags you around. And my kids, I don't know about yours, but my kids just let the autoplay just keep going. So
my kids have never, ever, 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 I want to be clear, ever, when I say ever, I mean never, spent 6-7 hours sucked into YouTube.
So I wanted to capture some of the videos that she has about some of the stuff that your phones do, because I keep telling my kids, like they know that I don't carry my cell phone and stuff like that. And I wanted somebody else to have an explanation because she got the nice graphics and all that sort of stuff. So one of the projects that I put in my data center, which we might get into a little later, is PinchFlat, which is a nice way to go get a bunch of metadata so that the downloaded YouTube videos integrate well into Jellyfin. So they show up with all the thumbnails and all that good stuff. And as part of that, I started getting, after about 4 or 5 videos, I started getting 403 errors. And I started poking around at this, and I found that YouTube DLP has logged this issue, as has PinchFlat and several other places. And it is related to Google clamping down and actually starting to ban IPs, even temporarily. So my residential IP, while the browser worked, somehow they were able to tell the difference between the browser and the agent, like the YouTube DLP agent. And so I guess my temporary solution for that was there's a way to generate a cookie for YouTube after you've logged in that kind of stays permanent, because YouTube rotates their cookie very frequently based on how long your browser's been open. I'll spare you the details of that. That's kind of boring, but suffice it to say, I took that cookie and I fed that into the download program, and then I rate limited it to 200K. And so far, that's me knocking on wood, it's been okay.
So you started down this path because you ran into a problem trying to download a YouTube video. What's kind of interesting to me is I have run into the same issue. However, I am very much using YTDLP as a privacy tool. So for me, I have tried to form the habit in which I don't do anything whatsoever from my house IP address. Someday, it's a bit aspirational, but someday I hope that I will be able to convince both my wife and all of my kids that it's beneficial to not do anything from the actual IP address that's tied to the physical location you're at. Have that IP address, use that to get onto the internet, use that to connect to Tor or some other VPN service, and then go out to the rest of the world. And it was about 2-3 years ago that I started this. And initially my concern was that I was going to have this big reduction in speed. I had this if I'm going to jump over to California, then up, but really I haven't noticed much of a difference. And so largely that's been my standard. And as a part of doing that, you start to notice what works and what doesn't. I drew a line in the sand and I said, okay, from now on, Noah Chalaya connects out from this particular service. And I stuck to it. The problem with doing that was, or the problem that I ran into rather, was YouTube does not want to allow me to use their service unless they can identify who I am. So the first thing I ran into is when connected to a VPN or when connecting out of a data center, it will just say, even from youtube.com, will say, sign in to prove you're not a bot. YouTube DLP or YTDLP certainly won't work. The other problem is that the reason I want to do that is because I don't want to have to sign into an account. I don't want to I just want to be a person on the internet that wishes to consume that content. And so in my perfect world, what would happen is Google would allow me to YTDLP that video. I would pull it into my local collection. I'd watch it as I wish. And now there's no log of it. And now there's nothing. Now, again, like you, I accept to a degree that if it's on YouTube, it's public content. There's nothing super, there's nothing private or it feels slimy to me that Google makes this arbitrary thing that they want you to have an account and they want to be able to track, lest they're not just going to let you do it. There's a couple of other ways that people have gotten around this, and you will have linked in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com, the GitHub issue request, in which the YTDLP folks are simply just, as other projects are breaking, saying, here's the issue, here's the issue, here's the issue. So one way around it, and again, your mileage may vary on some of these, is they changed from IPv6 to IPv4. And so that worked for some users. Another user, refreshing the public IP so that it worked for me, looks like YouTube are detecting the download and banning via IP. The most elaborate one was a guy who said, I have a separate script that I use, and it produces a YTDLP download command as follows. And then he gives the command, and he said, without the TAC4, it will not download. With it, it downloads. If they're blocking by IP, why does it work with multiple times by IP? It hasn't changed. I'm on comp. And then he goes on to some other details as to try to get to the short of it. But the people, the maintainers of YTDLP have effectively said, we know this happens in data centers. We're largely not in a position to do anything about it because it's happening on YouTube's end. And Noah, is personally afraid that if this path continues and YouTube continues to tighten down, Google continues to tighten down the clamps, in the end, Google's customers are people that have smartphones. And so if they find that Google's customers are not nerds downloading stuff with YTDLP, and they went to court to try to shut down YouTube DL, and that blew up in their face. And so I see this as the next effort.
It's really unfortunate all around. I find it a little bit unfortunate. It's like, I understand on one hand that they're trying to recoup monetary value from, getting ad revenue and all of the rest of that. On the other hand, I feel like banning because you're downloading the videos is, especially when I took the approach of like actually feeding you my token, like, who I am now. Mm-hmm. Like,
why do you care how I want to watch it? Exactly.
Like that really kind of is really unfortunate. But at the end of the day, we all know that if you don't own it, that is kind of the whole root of the problem. And there isn't much you can do if they decide that you're going to do a rug pull. And as much as YouTube is a huge benefit, I guess my life will go on if I don't have this content.
I agree with you, and I don't primarily get content from YouTube. I'm really more of a Usenet guy than YouTube. So I don't necessarily disagree with that, but it is of note to me as I watch one company after the other talk about their quote unquote social media presence as if to say that's how they expect to interact with other people. Meanwhile, we're watching before our very eyes as the inaccessibility of YouTube continues to rise. If you happen to have the misfortune of living inside of an apartment complex or working inside of an office building that has had its IP banned and you don't understand technology, you just won't be able to solve this problem. And so, and if you use a product or so for example, it's not just everybody. What's the web browser thing? Is it Media Downloader? That's an extension that you put into your web browser. Mm-hmm. That's YTDLP underneath the hood, right? And that's very popular for people to go download YouTube videos. And so those tools are just going to stop working. And I don't know. It's kind of frustrating.
It's hard to say, right? Because it's hard to know what kind of JavaScript detection is happening. If it's being called from the browser, it's really hard to know what's happening. Like those tools might be able to adapt once they figure out. See, the good and the bad thing about JavaScript is it's technically open source. You can obfuscate it, but a really motivated individual would be able to work around that. Where we are going to have a lot of trouble is, so this idea of adding the IPv4 flag doesn't work when you are using a tool that builds on top of YouTube DLP. So for example, PinchFlat does not support this. You cannot tell it, like there's no way for you to tell it what to do. They have like an advanced extra options, which is a way for you to pass stuff into YTDLP through it. However, it has to explicitly support that flag in order for it'll read the file and it won't error if you put something bad in there. But there's myself and someone else in a thread that on PinchFlat's GitHub page that's talking about, hey, we want to pass in these rate limiting flags that YTDLP has because that might also help with the banning. And the response from the maintainer is like, I don't explicitly support that, so it's not going to do anything. So it's going to have a wider impact on things like, so there's PinchFlat and there's YouTube Archiver or YouTube Archivist, sorry, and several other of these kind of projects that have been built around that are going to have a splash, like a have a giant effect where they might diminish or go away completely.
1-855-450-NOAH, 855-450-6624. The email, live@asknoahshow.com.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of January 5th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. SysVNet 3.13 has been released. pzip 10.2 is out. The community build of Proton, GE Proton, now has a newer version available. Version 9.22 includes updates of various upstream components and adds plenty of game fixes for Linux Desktop and Steam Deck. In distro news, Linuxberry 1.40 is now available. Gentoo Linux 2025.0 is out. Sparky Linux 7.6 has been released. And Nobara, the gaming distro based on Fedora, has updated to version 21 of Fedora and switches to using the open source NVIDIA driver. And lastly, Valve has just published the Steam survey results for December 2024, and they reflect a nice upward trend for the Linux gaming statistics. In November, the Steam survey reflected a 2.03 market share for Linux. In December, the market share was 2.29%.
So, Steve, you kind of embarked upon somewhat of a data center this week. You started with the process of trying to set up Prometheus and ended up blowing apart your entire home lab and launching the Ovens data center. I'm interested to hear how that started, but I have a feeling it has to do with containers, and I have a feeling containers have to do with image. So let's catch up on image. When we last left off, you were playing with it a little bit. You were starting to see some advantages in by way of, facial recognition. There's some cool stuff, but I don't think it quite sunk into this is a major replacement. And to make things more complicated, you and your wife were using Nextcloud with great success. Everything is working well. It does everything you wanted it to do. And so you really didn't have a need for image. Can you pick up where we left off with image and walk us through how that wound up with a data center in your house?
Yeah. So I suppose you covered the synopsis quite well. Moving forward over the Christmas break, I kept prodding my wife, have you looked at image? Have you looked at image? I did this thing. Have you looked at it? Please acknowledge me. Validate my life choices, And so she poked at it here or there. I was like, that's kind of nice. But I started sending her pictures from, the this day in history kind of right on the main feed. Mm-hmm. And she liked that. So I suppose I embarked upon how do I integrate image in a way that doesn't disrupt us. And that was where the root of a bunch of this came from. When you upload files, so I started by uploading just gobs of files, and it took a very long time. I put 27,000 files on 27,000 pictures and some 4,000 videos, and that took a very, very long time. Not only that, it took it and did stuff it did its AI stuff and did it did transcoding and it did all that sort of stuff. And as I was looking at that, the nerd in me went, it says it can do this stuff remotely, and I've just shoved image in a VM running, it's running in a container in a VM somewhere. And I have this AI, this machine that I built to do AI, and it's on most of the time, but it just doesn't do anything. So I went around figuring out how do I do remote processing for that? And I was largely successful. I haven't been super successful getting it to do some of the experimental remote features, but for the most part, I was able to offload a ton of that resourcing out. And so we looked at it, it was it did a pretty good job of recognizing people and photos and stuff like that. If you go to the section inside of image, there's one for just people, and it will group photos based on the face that it has detected, right? Uh-huh. And that was kind of nice, right? Be able to pull up all of the pictures of, and it did a really good job. So my almost 13-year-old, we've got 13 years worth of photos. It went all the way back and was able to correctly identify, I would say, probably at least 80% of the photos when he was a newborn, from newborn right through. Yeah. That was the impressive
cool that
part.
It's all local? They're not using some server thing. Those images of your kids aren't going up to some server and stored on something. It's all local.
And yeah, and like I said, that was the impressive part when I was like, hey, come and look at this. And we just clicked on picture of Mateo, and there's Mateo at 3 months old splashing around in the pool. Like, how did this know it was him? And it also did some really interesting things. Like, so my wife has an aunt, and we have pictures of my wife's aunt in the 80s, and somehow it knew that it was her in the 80s. And she does not, like, I don't know how you did that, like how you could do that, because if I didn't know her, I don't know that I'd been able to pick it out. And so it was just kind of a really impressive, like, wow, it did a really good job finding this stuff. So I embarked on making it more production ready. And what I mean by that is I didn't want this thing actually managing my photos. I didn't want to upend the current flow with all the automation around Nextcloud and the backups and all the rest of that. So how do I get images into Image without being worried that it does bad things to them?
How indeed.
So I guess the short answer to that is they have recently implemented external libraries. And so I am mounting my Nextcloud folders directly into Image. Now, the catch here is every 6 hours on my NAS, all of the pictures from all of the locations get hoovered up and shoved in a directory that's called all photos with duplications. So that I always have a backup of what's happening to the photos, but I also allow Image to go and actually dedupe the stuff coming off of the phones. And again, this is like, I don't really trust you. I have to, in order for it to do some of the neat stuff, it needs read access. So I guess I'll back up just a tiny bit. I tend to not trust any software to do media management. So Plex and Jellyfin, so we're now on Jellyfin, but Plex before it, both of those only ever had read-only access to the stuff that I let it access. And so I've always had this, like, you can look at it, but I don't know what you're doing, and I don't want you to accidentally delete something that's important to me. So I kind of tried to take the same approach with Image, except it complains. Like, my word, I jammed like a gig's worth of logs because it just, like, in a day and a half, because it just was like, of like these thousands of photos, I can't do this, whatever it was trying to do. And so finally I just gave it write access to these after implementing this series of scripts that just go and make sure that I'm always pulling all of the pictures to one place before Image is allowed to do anything to it.
So you got Image up and running. You pointed it towards an external library, so you're able to take advantage of all the features that were available with Image while still maintaining your existing library. How did that land in? Talk me through how that led to your container host.
So ultimately, I wanted to do a thing which was run Image, and I looked at trying to stand things up because my preference is to not run it inside of a container. I want to know how the bits work. However, the project very strongly discourages you from doing that unless you're going to like launch the development version. And even then, it very strongly discourages you. Like, the sanctioned way is to run a Docker container. And they give you like a Docker Compose. And of course, I tried to run Podman, and there are some minor differences between what Podman does with a Compose file and what Docker does. And it behaves strangely. Like, if I did a Podman Compose up, it would come up and act strangely. And then I'd bring it down and do a Docker Compose up, and it worked perfectly. And I don't know what the difference is. I don't really want to dig into that. And so I thought, well, if I've capitulated on running a container, there's going to be other things that the prescribed way to run this is, hey, we distribute it via Docker container unless you're doing specific development. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to throw in the white flag on this one, I probably should dedicate some space to it. So I ended up with a container host, which is actually confined inside of a VM because that's just how I roll. But yeah, I now have a container host inside of my network just for this.
So the container host inside of a VM actually doesn't surprise me. In fact, I'd be more surprised if you didn't put it into a VM because it would feel like you're going backwards, right? I understand the argument that the container host is ephemeral. We don't care about it. It's just there as a tool to serve up the containers. So we don't care if the container host goes away. We don't care if the containers go away. At the same time, I would say I personally like the idea of if you built a vhost and you had everything running in VMs and now you're going to go into containers, instead of going back to the metal, why not just have the containers run inside of a VM? Even if you only had one VM on the vhost, I've seen the slides from this tiny little company, maybe you've heard of them, called Red Hat, talks about the efficiencies of KVM going straight to the kernel. So I don't really see the downside to virtualizing, and I would tell you that you get all of the added advantages of now this entirely ready to run little computer just exists as an image on your computer. I like that. So that part doesn't really surprise me. The part that does surprise me is when you go to set this up, how many containers, or how would you go about evaluating the amount of workload that you can run on that VM before you said, now I need a second container host? Or would you say it's a function of I can run as many containers as I need to run. I'll just continue to up the resources or add more resources to that VM.
I'm just going to continue to up the resources for the foreseeable future because like I'm not going to rip out my VM infrastructure. Like between VMs and physical hosts, I have something like 76 hosts, and I'm not going to just start shoving those in containers for the sake of doing so. What that also buys me is I put, lots of people in the Nginx. I'll die with my Apache just because of my familiarity there. So I put an Apache reverse proxy on that, and I just find that much easier to do vhosts when I have everything on one container, right? So I have one place that all of my vhosts exist that are doing the reverse proxy into the container, and it's handling the certificates and all the rest of that, as opposed to expanding the number of container hosts. Now, maybe that'll change in the future if I start getting uncomfortable with like, hey, I have 20 containers. Maybe I should start not having so much of a single point of failure. But right now I'm at like 5. So probably will continue that in the future.
Interesting stuff. So when you were migrating, why a migration to a container VM? It's just because that's what Image told you to do, and you were like, well, if I'm digging in with one container thing, I may as well just embrace the fact that I work with containers all day. So now if there's something else that wants me to do it in containers, I'm just set to do that?
I suppose the spirit is correct, but not really the phrasing. Like the issue that I had was Image is complex. It is a complex beast to set up, and it was going to be a significant lift for me to dissect this and then try and get it working and then put all the pieces together myself, right? And on top of the fact, like, so Image has a bunch of stuff going against it from my standpoint. Okay. It's complicated. It's dealing with something that is sacrosanct. Like the pictures need to be there. Like if you mess that up, like that's the one digital thing. Like we've talked about this in the past about like, if all the computers blew up, what would I do? I'd go outside, right? Like, but the pictures need to be there at very least until I can like get the ones printed that we really want to store in binders, and then they can go away. But pictures are sacrosanct. So it's complicated. It's dealing with sacrosanct data. And on top of that, they tell you not to have it as the only source of backup. That
Who does? Image?
Yeah. So to me, in my brain, that translates as this is not production ready. And I don't think that is an unfair statement. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work well. It just means that like they realize that they're dealing with precious memories and that they're not at a place where they're comfortable with that level of responsibility. And if they're not, then I'm not. And so on top of the fact that I would now be trying to learn how do I put together all of the pieces, because like the Docker Compose, I believe, has 3 or 4 different containers, including they have one of the things that helps you run this remotely is it spins up another container that can just talk directly back and forth to a remote Image server so that it can coordinate things.
So run that by me one more time. So you have your image server if you want to do.
So when we get in, so I mentioned that the nerd in me was like, oh, I can probably do some of this remote processing on a more powerful machine that has like an actual good GPU in it for the AI related stuff that it does. Mm-hmm. Well, part of the way that you do that is inside of the Docker Compose, you actually, there's an additional container that runs that just handles that level of stuff. I forget what it's called. I'm going to call it the executor. I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But you run that container on your host and one on the remote host, and they talk to each other, and that's how it receives, like how the remote host receives jobs. And so all that to say is when you're talking about a level of complexity to set this thing up, and then the project says, this is the way that is kind of the blessed way to install software. Well, okay, now I'm fighting a super uphill battle. It's something I don't understand for a project that's not production ready, and that distributes something in a way that like they have a path and I'm specifically going off of that path. That all seems like a recipe for bad.
Yeah, I mean, when the software maintainer themselves says, hey, we wouldn't really, I think that's kind of the writing on the wall. So on the other side of it, you got it connected to the external library. You're at a place where you are confident in it. Now, you don't have to necessarily trust the front end to know that, you're going to, that your photos are going to be safe. On the other side of it, do you like it? Are you pleasantly surprised, or do you look at it and say, nah, it's still kind of not really for me?
So I suppose I'll answer that in two ways. So what do you want first, the good or the bad?
Good. Give me the good first. Leave me with the bad.
All right. The good stuff. It does a really good job of classifying pictures, like faces and stuff like that. It does a decent job with the location. Does a decent job with the searching. For example, we searched things like Christmas tree and Disney and stuff like that, and it was pretty effective at that, and dog, and so it's pretty decent with the search. This was a surprise to me. I was in Image, I clicked the share button, and I didn't know what this was going to do, and then I sent it to somebody on Telegram, and what it did in the background was it downloaded the photo to my phone and then uploaded it via Telegram, because I wasn't sure whether that's just going to try and send them a link to Image. Like, I didn't know what it was going to do. I liked that approach because Image is not publicly accessible. So I didn't know what it was going to do with the share. I liked that. It saved me some steps. So I suppose those are the good. The other thing that I do like that is not a particularly difficult thing that they implemented on when you log in, along the top, the very first row is kind of like a this day in history, and it goes back as far as your history wants to go, and you can kind of look at those pictures. I like that. So they did, I like that quite a bit.
That's very cool. And after asking the wife a few different times to check it out, did we finally get hooked, or was it like as good as it got was pretty cool?
Well, so I guess that kind of gets me into like some of the bad. So I fully recognize I am not using it in the prescribed way. So with that disclaimer, right? The issue that we have is that when you have the external library, it gets connected to a user. And so it doesn't get connected to all accounts. It gets connected to a user. You can then share that out. But here's the challenge with that. You can share out an album. You can share out the entire picture directory. But what it doesn't do is the stuff with the metadata. So like when you click on people, it's empty. Like there's no faces there because the user that you're logging in as is not the person that imported the external library. That is kind of a bummer because that's a neat thing. And so, and a lot of the stuff has been kind of discovered by accident. Like, hey, go look at this, honey. And then she'll come back. She's like, I couldn't find this. Or I told her like, hey, I made an album for this thing and it didn't automatically share the album, which was, of course it wouldn't. Why would it? Right? That's not a fault of the software, but it's the way that I'm using it. That the way that I'm expecting to use it is like, this is a photo album. In my brain, this is a photo album, and therefore, if you exist on the server, you should be able to just flip open the pages in the photo album. That's the way that my brain is using it. So I get that I'm not holding it correctly. However, that is a downside because that's what I'm looking for. Right. So, related to, so your question about how is she taking to it? My wife is very, very tolerant of while I'm working out the kinks of like, oh, let me go share that album or whatever. She goes into it more than she goes into her standard photo gallery because the Nextcloud sync, like, it shows up, right? So, I mean, there's that. So Sleuth in the chat room talked about partner share. Yes, I have looked at the partner share. It didn't seem to share the faces and stuff like that. And that's what I'm talking about. So we use partner share in order to share all of the pictures in the user who I set up. So the admin user was the one that I set up to do all of the ingesting of the photos and the remote stuff and all that sort of stuff. And then I created her and I a user, and then I partner shared those, which is how we can see all of the files. Like I said, the metadata stuff just didn't come through.
Very cool, Steve. This is very cool. I appreciate the fact that you dig into stuff, even if your initial reaction is, I'm not sure that would be useful. Eventually, the tech side of you or the nerd side of you is like, well, let me go leverage it for all it's worth, and you explore it to its full potential. And whether if it becomes useful, it becomes useful. If not, I'm sure you learned a lot along the way, and you got a data center in your house now.
Yeah, more to come on that.
All right, let's dig into some feedback. Our first email comes in from Dan. Dan writes in and says, gentlemen, thank you so much for the advice from 402 and 414. It's greatly appreciated. I'll do my best to have pictures and progress reports as we progress. How you know that he hasn't progressed, Steve, is because there's no pictures. That's if there was progress, there'd be pictures, just saying. One of the major things Wonder Wife is asking about is all wired connections to reduce EMF in the house. Now, I know who I'm speaking to, and from my understanding, you gentlemen run everything via Wi-Fi, and this is not a concern. That's understood. Wait, what? What did you just say?
Incorrect. Especially me. You should have heard me complain about the Wi-Fi trouble that I've had all the time, and it is only impacting the things that I literally can't run a wire to.
Steve's comment is something like, oh, the Wi-Fi is in and out. This thing may or may not be working. I don't know. I'm going back to work. But yeah, you and I have been pretty clear on this. The industry has been telling us that Wi-Fi is the equivalent of a wired connection since Wi-Fi came out back in the late 90s. And since the late 90s, everything that we've ever been told about Wi-Fi continues to evolve in... So first, WEP was going to be the equivalent of wired privacy, right? That's why they called it WEP. Well, that was a good joke. Didn't age well. You're never... In the end, what I would tell you, Dan, is that when you're talking about Wi-Fi, what you're talking about is a manufacturer who picked a frequency that operates in one of the chosen frequencies they're allowed to use, and you're just kind of banking and hoping that you and your neighbors are all going to work it out and that it's all going to work. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Just ask Steve. And so if it's really important to you and if you want it to work all the time, both Steve and I are going to suggest you run a wire to it. So, he goes on to ask, it's all good, but the three of us hold spousal approval in high regard, and that's what we're going for. No problem. In fact, I would go as far as to tell you that when I went to wire my house, I told my wife there's two ways we can do this. One way is that I'll try to leave as much of the house as is, and I'll try and work around it. Or two, I'm going to cut all manner of holes all over the house, but when I'm done, you won't see anything. And she opted for the latter, and so far she's been really happy with it. So, okay, so we will hold spousal approval at the highest bar, and we will hold reliability / a lack of interference at the highest bar. Got it. What do I need to run fiber through my entire 1,800 square foot house, the total package, and explain it to me like I'm 4, because in Linux, I'm only 10. All right. Here's the explain it to me like I'm 5, or like I'm 4. It is very expensive to, comparatively speaking, it is very expensive to convert photons into electrons and electrons into photons. So you want to do that as few times as possible. Typically, the way that fiber is used is with the interconnects. So for example, you might have a main network switch and you decide that you want to add an additional network switch closer to the other side of your house. And then from that switch, you're going to branch off and do a bunch of other things. You would not want the trunk between those two switches to be the same 1 gig length that goes from each of the switches out to the clients, because then all of the traffic is going to get channeled through that bottleneck. And so in that case, fiber is incredibly inexpensive. The dumbed down version is there are two modes. There's different kinds of fiber that you can get. What you're looking for is multi-mode fiber. Again, you're going to have an added cost when you're converting copper into optical or optical back to copper. And so we call those things transceivers. They're devices that convert light into electrons or electron back into photons or light. And you're going to need transceivers on every device that you want to use. So every computer that you want to plug fiber into, you're going to have to buy a card, a PCI card that accepts a transceiver, and then you'll have to buy a transceiver and plug it in. So we will have linked for you in the show notes, multi-mode fiber pre-terminated cable, which you can buy. It's 350 feet, 100 meters of it, and it will cost you $100. So it's not terribly expensive. It's about 3 times more expensive than Cat5. Cat5 is going to be 10 cents a foot. There's going to be like 30 cents a foot, right? So you can start there. That will get you the actual media you need. Now you're going to have to buy one of those for every run or every drop you're going to want to do. Additionally, you're going to need an SFP switch to bring all of those back together. And so we've linked for you an SFP switch. The cheapest out there is Unify. It'll do a great job. You're going to have to buy SFP adapters for that SFP switch, and then you'll be able to connect all the fiber together. So to recap, you need fiber cards in every workstation and or SFP cards with fiber transceivers. You will need pre-terminated fiber cable, and you will need a fiber switch. If you had those things, you would have a fiber network in your house. Now, fiber is very inexpensive, and if you're going to open up all the walls and run something in there, fiber is not a bad way to go because you're unlikely to ever outgrow it. You're unlikely to ever get to a point where it doesn't handle your needs. You're unlikely to get to a point where you're going to bandwidth saturate it. That said, I own an IT company. We run fiber and or install the equipment for fiber and certainly maintain it for a number of clients all the time. And I didn't run fiber in my house. I ran fiber from my network room to my lab where my computers are. I ran fiber when I put a second switch in, but I did not run fiber everywhere to my house. I did put 2 drops of Cat 6 in every wall, but to tie all of those together was just a 48 port $600 switch, as opposed to, again, buying SFPs, transceivers and all the rest of it. Steve, when we first talked about this, or when we looked at this email, your first answer was, hey, 1,800 square feet, that's actually approachable enough and fiber's cheap enough. Why not? Could you give us that spiel?
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, 1,800 square feet is not a super expansive situation. I guess the caveat here is my picture was 1 or 2 drops per room, and not like, as I'm reevaluating this, I look under my desk and I've got 3 copper right under my desk, and one of them goes into a switch, and that switch has 4 cables coming out of it. So if you're going to do something like that with fiber, it gets a little more expensive, I think, pretty quickly, because like Noah said, unless you're going to drop a fiber switch under your desk to help accommodate that sort of thing, you probably want to run additional fiber lines. That said, if you choose the right fiber, laying that infrastructure in your house is likely to future-proof you for future speed expansion, right? So you might go with 10 gig fiber now and maybe 40 gig when the price drops, and so on and so forth, up until the point where, and I actually don't know what the point a fiber cable is saturated at, but the end result would be you don't change anything in the walls. You would just simply change out the network cable or the network card in your end device, as opposed to copper, which has very distinct categories of speed that it can accommodate based on the twisted pair and the thickness of the copper and all the rest of that. So provided that you're not doing like me and in this room having, 10 wired devices, it might make sense for you to, if you can, through renovation and stuff like that, just run the fiber through the walls.
whatever you choose to do, I sincerely hope that you let us know and let us know what works. Let us know what doesn't work. Because we'd like to help you through this. And particularly if you're just getting started and you're kind of walking in and saying, yeah, I'm just not really sure. I'm just not really sure what I'm going to do. Or this is what I think I'm going to do. That I would, reach out and ask questions. You're going to have more as you continue on. So we would invite you to write back in. I think that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know. We'll have links for you for the PCI card, the fiber cable, and the SFP switch all in the show notes. You can find those at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Our second email comes in from Jeremy. Jeremy writes in and says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. I'm wondering what you do for fire safety in the home around a home lab. I have a section of unfinished basement that would be good to expand electronic projects. However, if it's 24/7, I'm a little concerned about how to monitor for a fire hazard. Note, I do have everything at least a few inches off the floor in the event of flooding. Outlet is a 20 amp with GFCI. Best, Jeremy." So, Steve, what's your fire plan?
Well, right now I call no, I'm kidding.
I'll be there in 5 hours.
Call the fire department, get out of the house. As I mentioned before, the only thing that's really sacrosanct in this house are the photos. And right now there's a 3-2-1 policy in terms of the backup. So we've got 3 copies in 2 locations, and one of them is offsite. And the one that's offsite is my Spider Oak account. I do plan to expand by putting a structure 100 feet from my house or something like that. Some good distance from the house. I've already trenched Ethernet out there in the general vicinity as well as power. And so I was planning on just daisy chaining off of an existing structure out there and then sticking a computer out there so that in the event of fire, I would have most of the stuff that I needed replicated. Like right now, I have network configs and I've got Home Assistant backups and I've got photos, and that's it. So it's like my entire infrastructure would be gone, but I'd be able to reconstruct my wiki and my networking if I ever needed to do that, and my Home Assistant if I ever had exactly the same thing. Now that I say it out loud, it doesn't make much sense to think that I'm going to be restoring a Home Assistant backup when I'd have completely new devices.
No home.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's mine. What are you doing?
Okay, so couple things here. So first thing is there are not all fire extinguishers are created the same. So if you're going to have a fire extinguisher, particularly a fire extinguisher that you want to work on electrical fires, it's very important that you purchase the right kind of fire extinguisher. So on the very front of the fire extinguisher, it's going to have a letter, and it's going to be a Class A fire extinguisher, Class B fire extinguisher, or Class C. You want to purchase a Class C fire extinguisher. During the pre-show, it was brought up to me that there is a Class D fire extinguisher that handles if you have like big battery banks. So if you have some sort of special need where you're going to be doing some real nerdy projects, you might want to consider those. My brief look almost caused me to have a heart attack when I looked at the price because they were almost like $400. So I'd struggle to tell you to do that, but I would definitely go to your nearest hardware store. I would run, not walk, to your nearest hardware store, and I would pick yourself up an ABC fire extinguisher. Here's the other thing you might do. If you can afford to do so, buy an ABC fire extinguisher and then buy a second one. It doesn't have to be ABC, but buy something cheap. And the next time you're having a fire out in your backyard, go take the fire extinguisher out there and play with it. It sounds kind of silly, but the first time you're operating a fire extinguisher shouldn't be when you're fighting a fire. And when I was just a few years old, I was maybe 4, 5, 6 years old, my grandpa took me out into his backyard and brought a fire extinguisher, and we pulled the pin and did. It's helpful. You understand the mechanics of it. Prior to that, I didn't know the pin had to be pulled, and I didn't know if you pulled the pin, I thought the fire extinguisher would just start spraying. I didn't realize you had to squeeze the thing. And I was unpleasantly surprised to learn how fast the fire extinguisher goes empty. And so you learn all those things by playing with it and trying it. So I would encourage you not only to just buy a fire extinguisher, I would encourage you to practice using it. Go look up a video or research the, sweep towards the bottom of the fire, that sort of thing. Okay. Past that, you ask how to monitor for a fire hazard. Well, a couple things you can do. So Honeywell makes a number of different pieces of equipment for this kind of thing. It's primarily targeted towards commercial buildings in which they want to evacuate the building in the event of a fire, and they make two different sensors. One is a heat sensor that basically has a small little wax deal inside of it, and if the wax melts, the sensor triggers and tells you, hey, there's excessively high heat, there's probably a fire, get out. The second is what are called Honeywell smokes. And the smokes are essentially, it's kind of the same thing. It's essentially like a two-wire system. But the smokes essentially have a little, a little laser type thing, a little light type thing. And if the light becomes interrupted by some sort of material in the air, that triggers. And so you could do those kinds of things, and you can do a couple different ways. If you're in Steve's boat where it's just getting out of the house and calling the fire department, well, just have it set off a siren and have it contact a monitoring company. I have typically recommended Alarm Relay, alarmrelay.com. They're inexpensive. They'll work with a variety of different brands, DSC, Honeywell, whatever. If you don't want to go that route, you could also add those things into Home Assistant, and then you could have Home Assistant trigger you an alert, and then you can decide if you're Noah and you do the Noah plan, you go and pee on it, versus the Steve plan, you get out of the house and stay safe. I don't know, whatever works. But my disaster recovery plan in my house is, and I know before I say this on the air, this is going to fly in the face of if you work in fire safety, plug your ears. If you work in law enforcement, plug your ears. If you're bothered by redneck type things, plug your ears. I have a HP ProLiant microserver that I purchased. And what I like about it is that it has, in addition to an SSD boot drive, 4 additional spinning Rust drives. Inside of that computer, there is enough RAM and enough disk that I'm able to replicate my entire infrastructure in my house with the microserver. And so at the moment, that microserver sits in a closet about 4.5 feet, 5 feet from the front door of the house. And the idea is that in the event of an emergency or flooding, fire, whatever, I will, on my way out the door, reach into that closet, grab that ProLiant microserver, and if everything goes according to plan, and as long as the fire ain't too hot, I'll be able to get out of the house with not only a copy of all my data, but at least the basic hardware platform necessary and requisite to bring back up the VMs and restore them and reattach the disks so that I can make not just the data available, but all the services serving up the data available wherever I happen to land up, be that a hotel room for a while, an apartment, or another house, or whatever it is. So that's kind of the approach that I've used. You'll notice in our approach that neither Steve or I, Jeremy, put a ton of effort into trying to stay ahead of the fire and then trying to prevent that. Maybe that's our ignorance. Maybe that's we're willing to sacrifice our houses to save our lives, so to speak. So I'll let you make that decision. But the answer you're looking for, you can, if you have GFCI on, you might consider arc fault breakers. You might not consider them because if you talk to electricians, you'll find that they're the first people to rip them out of their house. So I don't know, but that could be some things you could do in the way of preventing fire. But if I was looking to try to monitor for a fire, I'd be looking for two things. I'd be looking for, is there heat? And I'd be looking for, is there smoke? And if you see either of those two things, that would be your first and second sign that you have a problem and you might want to do something. The question is, are you at your house enough that if you got an alert like that, you'd actually be able to respond or do anything? If not, I'm going to encourage you to go the route that Steve and I are going, which is just have the data safely somewhere else. If you want to be a crazy redneck like me and say, well, as long as I don't have to get any closer to the burning house than a camping fire, I'll be just fine. If you're willing to do that, you can maybe put some thought into where you would position your backup so you can grab them on the way out the door. But the smart, wise answer would be just let it burn. Go get a backup. Music in ears means we're out of time. We're back next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com.